Good evening and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. My name is Brian Eggle. I am from Glasgow Skeptics and I am your host for the evening. Skeptics in the Pub Online has been around since the start of the pandemic, and even though that's calming down a little bit, we are certainly not bringing you science and skepticism every second and fourth Thursday of the month. This is event number 82 since we kicked things off. So we're well on our way to triple figures soon. I'm sure there's a lot of applause in the Twitch chat for that. Since I've inspired you so much, you're probably thinking, how can we support you more, Brian? Well, you can throw money in our direction to help us with running costs. You can buy some merchandise, or just turning up tonight's a good start, right? Or watching us on our YouTube channel. We do record most or all of our talks and put them on YouTube. We also release them as a podcast. You can catch us on Discord as well. And please look out for your local Skeptics in the Pub group, who across the country and across the world are now starting to run face-to-face events again. Glasgow Skeptics certainly is one of those. So catch us if you're ever in town. So our format for the evening, our presenter is going to regale us with great tales of spooky stuff for approximately 45 minutes. During which time you can have some fun banter in the Twitch chat. Keep it nice and polite though. Our moderators are standing by with the ban hammer just in case. If you do have any questions, we'll be posting a Q&A link into the Twitch chat as well, and you can follow that, post your questions and upvote other people's questions as well. We'll go to the break after the talk. We'll be checking out those questions during the break, and then we will reconvene and I will be expertly interrogating our presenter with the aforementioned questions. After the talk ends tonight, we are going to the Lock-in's Razor, our Zoom pub, and you're more than welcome to meet us there later on this evening. So, over to our speaker for this evening. Deborah Hyde is the former editor of The Skeptic and is a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. She writes and lectures about belief in the malign supernatural, with special regard to the folklore, psychology and sociology behind belief. More recently, she's been involved in the excellent BBC podcast called Uncanny, well worth checking out. You'll see or hear Deborah and a number of other skeptical heroes on that podcast, trying to shower a little bit of reason on some spooky goings on. But, you know, the pinnacle of Deborah's career was obviously speaking for us at Skeptics in the Pub Online last year. And she was so damn good that we've brought her back again. So without further ado, Deborah, the floor is all yours. Go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me back. This is fantastic. Tonight, we're going to talk about a bit of a peculiar case of witchery. Many years ago, it was in the 15th century. And I suppose what I really wanted to do was kind of challenge the idea. Well, I wanted to give a bit of context for something, for a witch trial, because more often than not, we hear about witches who are highly caricatured through both fiction and also through propaganda. So Brian has explained who I am, so we don't need to go through that, although please do follow me on Twitter. That's probably the biggest, the most frequent social channel that I'm on. As he said, I was editor of the Skeptic magazine. We're going to talk about heresy, sorcery, royalty and a witch, because counterintuitively, royalty did mix with at least one witch, probably more. Let's start with a question. Which of these two women do you think is the witch? I found out last time when I gave this story that may well be Amber Heard modelling that top photo. I wouldn't recognise her. But if it is, don't let that confuse you. Just think in terms of who is more likely to fit your caricature of a witch. Of course, it's the woman at the bottom. It's Endora from Bewitched, because she is older and she doesn't look as pleasant, frankly. We've got a picture of Chattox, one of the Lancashire witches. This is a trial considerably later than the one we're going to talk about today. The Lancashire witches were prosecuted in 1612. And so it was a different era. the kind of the victim pools was from a different demographic by that point. And this illustration was done in the 19th century by Ainsworth, but you can still see there is the caricature. There is this sort of bitter old woman, sort of wizened and bent over and wrinkly. And here we have a wonderful illustration by Chas Adams, who did the Addams Family. And I like to think of this photograph as my aunties in the bath, because my aunties were a bit bizarre too, which is why I got interested in all this stuff. So let's hear what they have to say about Margery Jourdemayne, not my aunties, the contemporary chroniclers. In fact, this was written about a century after Margery Jourdemayne's trial and execution in 1441. The Mirror for Magistrates, which was a collection of stuff published around about 1560, you can see that, that there was an old beldam called the Witch of Eye. Old Mother Madge, her neighbours did her name. So she was a witch. She lived in a place called Eye, which is actually Ebury. There's a manor called Ebury in Westminster, who wrought wonders in hearsay. Fiends and fairies, her charming would obey. So she's in charge of sort of, you know, lesser demons, imps and fairies. Fairies weren't nice in traditional folklore. That's a kind of 19th century Baudelarisation that we think fairies give wishes and things. Traditionally, they were rather dangerous and damaging. Dead corpses from the grave she could uprear. That's serious. That's necromancy. That's kind of high magic. That's being able to do some serious black magic. And at that time, such an enchantress had no peer. So several references to her old age and certainly to her great power. So that is what they were thinking of a century later. Let's have a look at that word beldam. It's not flattering. An old woman, especially one who's considered ugly, a malicious or loathsome old woman. So again, even just a century after her execution in 1441, we have a caricature of a nasty old woman. And here we have a picture from Shakespeare's Henry VI. This was again illustrated far later, but you can see that Margery Jourdemayne here is doing some really high magic. She's dealing with the devil. So she's not doing little tricks. She's not just sort of helping people with bits and pieces here and there. This is hardcore. This is interacting with the devil, and there's her helpers around behind her. And she, for some reason or other, is wearing a sheet rather than a frock. I don't know why. And we can see here that the artist hasn't done her any favours. He doesn't think that she's young or attractive either. In fact, he appears to have used Vinnie Jones as a model. So if we're going to look at the Bible and we're going to look at the religious background of whether or not somebody should be dabbling with magic, it's usually taken, there's a precedent that's very clear from the Bible, from Deuteronomy, that people really shouldn't muck around with these dark powers. The first line is very clearly a reference to something called the Pits of Tophet. Don't know if you've ever heard of that. That was where different sects in the ancient biblical lands practiced slightly different religious rites, and the Pits of Tophet were where they sacrificed their own perfect firstborn to the gods. So this was disapproved of by what was sort of becoming established as the sort of Judaic strand of that kind of religion. And so they made this very strong reference: don't let anyone, don't associate with people who immolate their sons or daughters in the fire. But neither a fortune teller, a soothsayer, charmer, diviner, caster of spells, one who consults ghosts, or seeks oracles from the dead. Again, we've got necromancy there. The idea that you could raise someone up from the dead and then you could ask them things. You could ask them to tell you the future because they know more. They have more subtle powers since they have died. So if you've got this precedent in the Bible telling you not to do this, what you're left with then is people hundreds, perhaps even thousands of years ago, there is clearly power in the world. We know, as being skeptics, that we see things in a peculiar way. Our senses are designed to help us survive, not to help us scientifically probe the universe. That's actually a rather counterintuitive thing to do. So if this power exists, and to most people, at most times, it has been perfectly obvious that it does. So, well, then in that case, can you channel and manipulate it? And the answer to that in the early church by a document called the Canon Episcopi was no. The Canon Episcopi was written down a little later, but it's probably 9th century or so. And the idea was that it directed bishops to try and get rid of fortune tellers and soothsayers from their areas. Now, this wasn't because they were really telling the future. It's because they couldn't do it. They were pulling the wool over people's eyes. They had more of a kind of a modern approach to it, which is that somebody can't possibly have these powers, but nonetheless it's not very good for the community. If people do fall into this trap, they're putting their own souls in danger, they're putting other people's souls in danger. That's one of the later copies of the Canon Episcopi. You can see from the various quotes that I've got there that they didn't believe, you know, certain old woman have been led astray. So you can't tell the future. You can't actually have these powers that they claim to have. There's a moral hazard, but there isn't a real hazard of knowing the future. And if in this era you did believe that you could go to a witch and she could really manipulate the supernatural world on your behalf, that was idolatry and apostasy. The only person who really had power in the world was God. And you had to pray to God, and that was the only supernatural relationship that you were allowed to have, or that was even effective. If we look for why this was the attitude at that point, I think it's probably a good idea to do a quick breeze through the Christianization of Europe. You can see over here, over the case of a few centuries, that Europe became highly Christianized. So you've gone from an organization trying to establish itself to trying to keep the power that it has. So it's gone from increasing to consolidation. It's kind of gone from romance to marriage, I suppose. You can see an organization which is a monopoly. Later on, of course, there was the rise of Islam, and that pushed it back a little bit. And then there was a kind of a dynamic tension there for a few centuries. So when you have a situation where the world is Christian, your world is Christian, how do you relate to other people in it? Well, there can be a schism. There can be a departure in matters of government, but not in the basic principles of faith, what they call inward rather than outward separation. And in fact, there was a schism in 1054. There was a schism between the Eastern and the Western churches. It didn't stop them both believing that the others were Christian. It didn't stop the West coming to the aid of the East when it was encountered. If I look over here, it's because my dog's come for a cuddle. So yes, I mean, the Western warriors went over and helped with the Crusades because Islam was encroaching on the Eastern Empire. So they were still both Christians. They wouldn't argue that. But there had been a schism. Part of that was the East's refusal to regard the Pope as a supreme ruler of everything. You had infidels, people of the book, as a Muslim would say, and so they were monotheists, but they weren't a Christian. There were heathens, and at this point there were still a lot of heathens. There were a lot of people with kind of paganish type practices or strands of practice to their Christianity. Heathen comes literally from the term to live on the heath, so it's some uncivilized person who's just living in a field somewhere. And then there's pagans in the very, very early days, or, you know, what was left of the Roman and the Greek empires. And we come across this term cunning man or woman. This is a practitioner of folk medicine, folk magic, and divination within the context of various traditions of folklore in Christian Europe. Now, when somebody is religious, they don't experience their religion as being compartmentalized. They might know what they shouldn't say to the priest. They might know the priest won't like it if they say they were doing X, Y, Z. But nonetheless, it's all part of an overall kind of idea of what the world is like. I mean, even using the word supernatural suggests it from our point of view, because we think it's above natural. To delineate those ideas, it really took an awful lot of philosophical work and a lot of scientific background. And it only has happened in the West in the last few centuries. So if you were to talk to a cunning man or woman and accuse them of being a pagan or being unchristian, they probably wouldn't know what you were talking about. They might know what the priest wanted and didn't want to hear, but it's on a continuum, you know, using sympathetic magic, using herbs, using spells, or incanting things. For them, it would all have been part of one sort of group of looking at the world. And then there's heresy. Now, we talked earlier about the church consolidating. And the thing about heresy is that this is something that only a monopoly can afford to do. It can only really decide that people within its community are outside of permitted belief. It's religious error, of course, the judgment there, held in opposition to the truth after it had been defined and dictated by the church in an authoritative manner. So that's from Aquinas and canon law. So the idea of free speech, of free thought, the kind of things that we would take for granted in order to enable progress, that isn't the way they did things. We're looking at a top-down intellectual situation here, where you work things out using raw materials such as the Bible, and a little bit of reason. Their ability to reason was limited by the philosophy they had at the time. And then it was declared, and the message went down in an authoritative manner. And you were in trouble if you didn't just take it, receive it. So there were lots of heresies. And the thing to remember, I suppose, is that there were heresies right from the beginning. Most people know that there was a Reformation, which somewhat completely broke up Europe into various different areas with different types of religiosity. Prior to that, the church had tried to establish a monopoly. So you might think, oh, well, the Reformation happened sort of 1520-ish onwards. But looking at heresies, it's worth just remembering that the fight against the centralization and the monopolization on a religious life and religious belief had been going right from the beginning. You've got the Gnostic heresies from the very earliest times. The Bogomils, they were 10th century in Bulgaria. And you've got the Waldensians from Peter Waldo in Leon. Something that a lot of these organizations had is that they wanted, first of all, to take spirituality onto a personal level. So they were going, well, I can pray to God without the mediation of a priest. I can have a spiritual experience without having it authenticated by somebody else. But in addition, it was usually political too. So the state was becoming top downwards and the church was becoming top downwards at this era in history, from kind of, 9th, 10th centuries onwards. So you're getting people reacting against being told what to do by very hierarchical, aristocratic, secular powers as well. And so quite often these heresies embodied not just a spiritual, but also a political element to them. There was the Albigensian heresy, which was, I think, might be one of the first kind of officially recorded genocides. I know it's been called a genocide. I can't remember by whom, but it was horrific. And again, that had a political element to it. In northern France, they were owed fealty by the southern French, by the people sort of down towards the Alps. But whether or not they could really quite control them was quite another matter. And in addition, they were fairly religiously independent too. So the church wanted to get them under their thumb, but of course the church has no army, so it has to wait until the state has a coincidental sort of agenda and it can use somebody else's army. And this was particularly bloody and horrific. At that point, they were you're wondering whether or not they would culturally, in the south of France, be sort of looking south to just over the Alps, or whether they'd be looking north to the rest of France. And this consolidated France to where it is now. But it was deeply unpleasant. You've got the Lollards with John Wycliffe in the 14th century in England. He translated the Bible into English again. You can see he translated it into English, and by again I meant you can see this attempt to deliver spirituality directly into the hands of the end user. Somebody wanted to sort of have their own connection with God. He was lucky to live where and when he did. He came a lot under the protection of certain political elements in England at the time. And if he'd tried to do the same thing 50 years later, he would have been killed during his lifetime for it, probably. He was protected by John of Gaunt, who was a very, very powerful magnate in England at the time, and Jan Hus, who inspired the Hussites, who started the Bohemian Wars of Religion. And I don't know if you've ever been to Prague, but if you can go there, you can see all sorts of little witches and things, and they come from the reputation that comes from this time, that the people of Prague were religiously independent, and they had part of the Reformation Wars there. So you have, what I wanted to show there, I suppose, by whizzing through all that, was that the idea that somehow people would argue against the authority of the church isn't something that happened all of a sudden. It was happening consistently, and it just kind of broke out and remained in certain places after the Reformation. But prior to that, it wasn't that everybody believed everything, or that everybody wanted to receive their religious life and their religious authority from other people. However, there was a pushback from the church itself. Dominic de Guzman was a monk. He died before the Dominicans were, before the Inquisition was established. But he wanted to create a group of people within the Catholic Church who could counteract heresy. And after the Albigensian heresy, this had been a big issue. So he created the Dominicans, and the Dominicans, otherwise known as the Black Friars, plenty of Black Friars areas within cities, that was what they were. That was where they would have their churches. And the Dominicans specialised in education. And by that, we shouldn't mean the kind of virtuous education that we might like, physics lessons and so forth. This was education, inculcation kind of thing. They figured if they could educate somebody, then they would think in the right manner. And they also administered the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was set up to deal with the kinds of heresies that we're talking about. And the problem with it from our point of view, really, is that we don't think in terms of it as being natural justice. It was established, the Inquisition was established in 1213 in Lombardy, and that was just shortly after the Albigensians. It surrendered the convicted to the appropriate civil authority. And so the civil authority could have just completely ignored it and said they haven't done anything wrong, but you would find yourself under the ire of the church if you would do that. They were expected to give the correct punishment, which could be very bad. In 1233, Gregory IX, the Pope, proclaimed the Dominicans subject only to the Pope. So now you have the Pope with kind of his own specific attack dogs going out, if you like, to do his work. Now, the mechanisms of the Inquisition, it was Roman law, so you had to prove your innocence. It's a bit like libel law in this country, where you were accused of something and it was up to you to say, no, I haven't, instead of up to somebody else to prove that, yes, you have. Sufficient gossip was usually a sufficient condemnation. The offences was correlated with heresy, and the witnesses sometimes weren't identified. We would think this is completely against natural justice. If the witnesses then recanted, they were punished because they had put their eternal souls at risk and screwed up the prosecution. And you weren't allowed a lawyer of your own, because if you really were a sinner, then that would put it would put their soul at risk. So you didn't get to necessarily know who had accused you, and you didn't get anyone to fight on your behalf. It's not what we would regard as good justice at all. And the judges were inquisitors. Now, Ad Extirpanda was a papal bull in 1252, and this created two what we would regard as perverse incentives. One perverse incentive, one thing that's natural against natural justice. The first thing was that a perverse incentive was that you were allowed to confiscate the goods of the person who you had prosecuted. And what they would do is they would split the goods when the person was inevitably found guilty, split the goods between the secular and the church authorities. In fact, there was a guy called Inquisitor Emmerich. I don't know if I've got this quote here, but yes, that was it. He said later on, he complained that there were no more rich people to prosecute because they'd all been got at. Who would bother prosecuting poor people when you couldn't make any money out of it? The other thing that Ad Extirpanda had was that torture could be used. Now, you weren't supposed to, in the beginning, use torture that would actually damage somebody, that would permanently injure them. They didn't know about PTSD in those days. Obviously, torturing anybody to any degree is very, very bad. But the torture that they started to develop later really did damage and kill people. So it might start off in what they would regard as a permissible way, but it got totally out of hand. Now, just in case we think that this was just the priests going around saying there's a witch, they really did have courts, and they were able to give out penalties. You can see here that there were, if you fell foul of sort of felonies like theft or something like that, then you would go to the crown. Other things came under the aegis of the church. So this is the thing that I want to bring home, I suppose, is that we're talking about real, actual power here. In 1401, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, became the king. He'd taken over from Richard II, and his father had been John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was that great magnate who had protected Wycliffe, among others. Certainly had protected a lot of free speech and what would be regarded later as heretical ideas. Bolingbroke was a reluctant king. He was later thought to have said that he didn't really think he had ever was king, but he'd been forced to go and to depose the other king because the other king was a bit of a twerp and had taken all of his land and his titles and all of this kind of thing. So for his own survival, for the survival of his line, he'd had to do it. He became the king because, after the other guy's been starved to death in the Tower of London, who's going to do the job? So this was, don't know if you've ever kept up with the Wars of the Roses, but this was one of those exchanges between the two houses. Henry Bolingbroke had a son. There were three of them. There was Henry IV, who was Henry Bolingbroke, Henry V, who was the guy who went over to France and did loads of battles, and then there was Henry VI, who was unfortunately a rather weak young man. Now, the thing about Henry Bolingbroke was that in 1401, when he came into power, he enacted a piece of legislation called De Heretico Cumberundo. It means regarding the heretic who is about to be burned, and it's been called one of the most repressive censorship statutes that's ever been enacted in England. And it was he doesn't seem, well, to judge by the way his father was, he probably personally didn't give much of a monkeys about this subject, but he had a quid pro quo to pay with various supporters. And this appears to be the price he had paid for the support when he had overthrown Richard II and become king himself. So people were prosecuted and were burnt to death under this. Now, people were normally hanged for witchcraft in this country, but we're not talking about witchcraft here. We're talking about heresy. William Sorcery was the first person. He was a Lollard. So we are talking about people who, again, they're trying to practice their own sort of specific kind of religiosity. He was burnt to death in 1401. There was another guy you might have heard of called John Oldcastle about 14, 15, 16. He managed to escape to Wales for a couple of years, but they caught up with him eventually. And probably the most high-profile person you will have heard of who was caught under De Heretico Comberundo was Joan of Arc. Now, this was entirely a political thing. At that point, the English did have some legal claim, if not moral claim, to whole swathes of France, and that was what those particularly bloody wars of the 15th century were about over there. And there were factions of the French who were in league with the English, and there were factions of the French who just were in France. So she managed to, I mean, France, the French military campaigns had been in a dreadful state. She managed to kind of rally things, sometimes by sheer good luck. She was an appalling warrior, an appalling tactician, but she was just the right symbol at the right time. So when the English got a hold of her, they wanted to discredit the king she had crowned by discrediting she herself. So they wanted to get her for heresy. And she was actually rather clever at her trial. She didn't fall into a lot of the pitfalls. But the two people who you can see on either side of her here after she was immolated for heresy, on one side there's John, Duke of Bedford, who's one of Henry the Fourth's sons, one of the Henry V's brothers, and the other one is Henry Beaufort, who is also a cousin a couple of generations back, and they were the English people who administered over Joan of Arc's trial. Now, let's have a look at the family tree. There we've got Henry's family tree, as I mentioned it. So he was the father. He had his son Henry V, who went to loads of wars in France. There's already one brother out of the picture, but there are two other brothers there for Henry V. There's John, Duke of Bedford, and then there's Humphrey. And then underneath, there's Henry VI, who ended up being king prematurely because his father died on the battlefield. And so the people around him ended up running the country on his behalf until he reached maturity. Now, Humphrey was married to a woman who he actually had two wives. His first one was, where's she gone? There we go. His first wife was Jacqueline of Hainault, and this was really very, very dynastic. It was it was a good political marriage for him. He didn't really seem to particularly have loved her. He actually dumped her in a rather disgraceful fashion on the continent and got a divorce or an annulment. And so he could marry a woman called Eleanor Cobham. Now, the interesting thing about Eleanor Cobham, she got on with the king, but she got on with both the kings, but Henry V and Henry VI. But she was an unlikely bride for him because she wasn't really the same as his social standing. And in fact, when we take a look at the times of his two marriages, we can see that he married Eleanor Cobham indecently quickly after leaving Jacqueline of Hainault on the continent. So we have a man who was very close to the throne. He was only a couple of deaths away, really, from being the king himself. And he had married this social climber. Given that he married her straight away after getting rid of his first wife, it has been suggested, obviously, that they may well have been having an affair for a long time prior to that. And they probably were. Why would you just marry someone instantly like that? The other thing about Humphrey was that he had a couple of illegitimate children from a couple of decades earlier. And so there we have Antigone. I can't remember the name of the son, but his daughter Antigone. So it has been suggested by some, certainly not by all, but it has been suggested by some that she may have been in the really tragic situation of perhaps having had an affair with Humphrey for a long time, watching him marry another woman for dynastic reasons, and possibly have actually given him a child which she was unable to recognise as her own. a man could recognise a bastard, but a woman couldn't. So that's only theory, but it's possible, I suppose. Certainly what we do know is that by the time that the events that we're talking about now, she was sort of getting towards 40 and she hadn't got any children and she wanted them. So what do we know about Margery Jourdemayne? Oh, something else I think that I whizzed over earlier, which I should have explained, was that John, Duke of Bedford, who was involved in the trial of Joan of Arc, did die. So now you've got two brothers missing, and Henry V has already died in the fields of France. So by the late 1440s, you have a protectorate. And if anything happens to Henry VI, who is very, very young at this time, then Humphrey is the king. He hasn't had children yet, so Humphrey is the king. He is incipiently very, very powerful. So what do we know about Margery Jourdemayne herself? This is where she comes in. How come a witch ends up entering this rarefied, intense political environment? Well, we can tell several things about her. First of all, we know she was called the Witch of Eye, so she lived in Eye or Ebury. Now, back in the day, probably 1,000 years ago or so, Westminster was a little island. It wasn't sort of solidly part of North London as it is now, or on the North Shore. And there was a watercourse that went through, and there was kind of like a ford over it, where there was a little settlement called Eye, and the manor was called Ebury. So it's possibly a working kind of hypothesis that she would have lived there. Lots of other people did, so why not her? And we know that she lived in that manor. Now, we can't do any archaeology on this particular spot because it's been redeveloped. Buckingham Palace apparently, according to some, still has watercourses running underneath it. They have to channel it rather the same way that they have to channel the Fleet coming down from Ludgate Hill. There are all sorts of rivers and watercourses running under modern cities that have been covered up over the years, and this is one of them. So seeing as we can't go and excavate her house, what else can we tell about her? Well, we don't know a lot about Margery herself. We only really know what we know through the trials, but thanks to the brilliant work of a woman called Jessica Freeman, and you can get her paper online, and I suggest you do. I think it's called Sorcery at Court and in the Manor, something like that. And she did a lot of work on Margery Jourdemayne's husband, by which we can infer a lot about Margery Jourdemayne herself. The thing that Jessica Freeman found out from the records about Margery Jourdemayne's husband was that he was kind of an age with Humphrey and with his wife, with Eleanor. So this puts paid to the idea that Margery was some sort of old crone. There are lots of records of William Jourdemayne's family, his father, his brother. His brother seems to have been the person who kind of inherited the estate because they had lands at Acton, which was way out west. Well, not too far, about 6 miles from Westminster. So the fact that William Jourdemayne went to work in Westminster meant that he probably wasn't inheriting the family farm. He was going out and working. But he was a skilled agricultural worker. The word Jourdemayne means day of hand, so sort of a day labourer, if you like. But he was certainly considerably more skilled and higher up than that. He had offices in the manor. He was kind of like part of the rising middle classes, if you like, a yeoman. So if William Jourdemayne was born kind of 1399-ish, 1400-ish, and if he didn't have to marry for dynastic reasons, if he could marry for pleasure, for love, then chances are Margery Jourdemayne was born kind of the same time. And that makes her, it doesn't make her some wizened old crone, that makes her middle-aged. Now, this was from Contemporary Chronicle. It said at this same time was a woman called the Witch of Eye, whose sorcery and witchcraft the same Dame Eleanor had long time used, and such medicine and drinks as the said witch had made. The said Eleanor enforced the foresaid Duke of Gloucester to love and to wed her. So this is the charge from the Contemporary Chronicle. This is how Margery Jourdemayne comes into the story. We already know that Humphrey had married another woman before for dynastic reasons, and that he suddenly married Eleanor. So what this is alleging is that Eleanor had to she'd had to go to recourse to dark magic in order to make the man even love her. And we know that she wanted a child and she couldn't have a child. So the second thing we know about Margery Jourdemayne from contemporary accounts is that she was into love and fertility magic. It's not at all unusual for a cunning woman. So she's middle-aged and she's into love and fertility magic, and she must be presentable. I mean, she's mixing in the highest in the land, and she has a product that people want to buy. The other thing that's peculiar about her is that when she was arrested with 3 highly educated men. They were called Roger Bolingbroke, Thomas Southwell, and John Home. Now, Roger Bolingbroke was an Oxford scholar. He was a member of Duke Humphrey's household. He was Eleanor's personal clerk. So he was a very educated churchman, and he was in that household. He was, he was a big guy. He was an important guy. Thomas Southwell, the guy in the middle, was a physician. So he had as much medical knowledge as anyone did in those days, which wasn't much, to be honest. And what he did was he cast Eleanor's horoscope. She said, "Can you cast my horoscope to see if I will be queen?" Now, back in those days, that was a very bad thing, because it was showing ambition, but it also meant that you were expecting that the king would die before his time. She was older than the king. So really, she was allowing her ambition to outstrip her good wishes towards the king. That was a really serious issue. He was convicted of saying mass with heretical elements. So he was possibly sort of an early Protestant type, Lollard type sympathies, but of course this was spun as him saying dark masses, saying sort of black masses, if you like. And the third person was John Home. He was canon of Hereford and St Asaph, and he was a chaplain to Humphrey and Eleanor. He actually ended up getting away with it. He was more of a connected nobleman than the other two, and because he'd only kind of assisted, then he got away with it a little bit. But the other two, Roger Bolingbroke ended up being put in front of St Paul's with a paper crown on and just being humiliated and made a fool of. And then he was executed in a horrific way. I think he was hanged, drawn and quartered. Thomas Southwell, he was also sentenced to death, but he ended up dying. I think that they said rather euphemistically he died of heartbreak or something like that. But the chances are that as a physician, he would have been able to get access to perhaps a poison and poisoned himself before he had a particularly appalling death. So that's another thing that we can say about Margery, is that she was aspirational. She was really networking with the top people in the land. And that isn't something that we might necessarily expect, that kind of social mobility at that time. And also for magical skills to be regarded as such hard currency. The next thing after that was she was very career oriented. And the reason that we know that is because of something that was the thing that really did for her. Margery had previous. Margery had already been arrested 10 years earlier for a charge that concerned sorcery. And she had, in that case, been implicated again with a clergyman, somebody called, possibly a friar called John Ashwell. So for at least a decade, that means Margery has been mixing with very learned churchmen, and that she has been involved with selling sorcery. So this has been going on for a very long time. Her freedom was conditional upon her good behaviour for the future, no more sorcery. And I think we can see how that went. But another idea to bring into the mix at this point was that our ideas of religion, perhaps on one hand, superstition on another, science, all of these philosophical strands that we find possible to disentangle to some degree or another might not necessarily, well, they didn't have the equipment to do that at that time. Science as a pursuit is something, it's necessary to come up with the philosophy of it. It's necessary to come up with double-blind experiments and good statistics and good methodology and stuff like this, and to come up with the idea of you can't prove a negative. And, this stuff isn't natural. So what we would regard as completely separate strands of belief, they wouldn't necessarily have. How do you tell? Like the moon does clearly affect the tides. You can predict the tides by the moon. So why can't you predict the future by someone's astrological birth chart? You need the intellectual equipment to be able to disentangle that. And that takes time. And we've got there, not according to some people, but we've got there with astrology. And so this was a point in history when humanism was rising, when the idea that you didn't have to take things from authority, that you actually could work things out from first principles, that you could do experiments, that the person who did the most thorough the most thorough experiments, the most thorough reasoning could be the person with the knowledge, rather than just somebody who had been given a title. And this had come through after the Renaissance, mainly through the sort of the preservation of Greek and Roman thought through the Islamic lands, and so what it was a whole new range, a whole new way of thinking in the Renaissance, and this was the beginning of it, and it enabled people to tease out the different types of thought. Back in those days, when we're talking about Margery Jourdemayne's day, the people who were most educated and who were most likely to be on the edge of this were quite often clergymen. So we shouldn't be surprised that the clergy were the people who had enough education to be able to read the Greek and Latin texts and to try and start making these inquiries so that they could tell the difference between magic and science. It was just at the beginning. And so perhaps they weren't as snobbish about high magic and low magic as we would be. So we can see that she was really career-oriented, and going back to that sorcery charge that she'd had the 10 years prior, she had given a bond of £20, huge amount of money, against her good behaviour. It was sorted by 3 men, and one of those men was a man named William Jourdemayne. So William Jourdemayne had bought his wife out of trouble, so we know she had a good marriage. He may have felt that her career was kind of, just a strand on the side, and it was women's life, and he didn't bother with it all that much. But it was more likely that he realised she had a career, she had status, she had a life that brought in money, and he certainly supported her. He supported her to the tune of £20, which is no mean thing. So there are a load of things that we have found out about Margery Jourdemayne that may have been counterintuitive if we were looking at all of those pictures of ugly, sort of wrinkly old women to begin with. Now, the fate for Eleanor and Margery, predictably, of course, was quite different. Eleanor was made to divorce from Humphrey, or to have their marriage annulled, because she had admitted, in effect, that she had got him to marry her with witchcraft. Now, the charges against Eleanor were probably political. I don't think anyone really gave a monkeys about whether or not Eleanor consulted witches. The thing about Humphrey was that he was still very, very keen on war in France. It was ruinously expensive. It wasn't working out. And yet he was very powerful, and he was devoting all of these powers in England to continuing this horrible war. Eleanor was his weak point. They went after her, and they unfortunately got Margery at the same time. I don't think that he married her because he was subject to witchcraft, but it was enough of a technicality that the marriage was annulled, and she had to walk around the city of London in a plain dress with a taper as an act of penance. And she just lived out the rest of her natural life somewhere up north. I can't remember where actually, but where she had a good enough household, but she was taken out of the mainstream. She was punished by being removed from her life. Margery Jourdemayne, unfortunately, didn't get away so lightly. She was burnt in Smithfield, which is just north of the city, and she was burnt alive. She apparently recanted just before she died, but that may well have been for the mercy of being strangled so that she would be unconscious as she was burnt, which is an incredibly painful way of dying. So Margery Jourdemayne, unfortunately, because she had previous, was able to be burnt alive as a heretic, not a witch, but she was also a witch. So I hope that the point of this story has come through, that, first of all, philosophically, differentiating between superstition, magic, religion, and science is quite a job. And you and I can read books and we can take advantage of centuries worth of thoughts in order to be able to do this. They couldn't do that. They were at the beginning of that. So this is a good example of how those subjects were still a little philosophically intertwined at the time. The second thing was that socially, she wasn't as held back as we might have thought. It seems that there was social mixing, and that sheer naked ambition would get you somewhere. So I hope you've enjoyed understanding about Margery Jourdemayne, the Witch of Eye, and something of the context and the times in which she lived. Back to you, Brian.
Deborah, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Very enjoyable. Also, plenty of applause coming in the Twitch chat there. Great excitement every time the dog moved as well. More of that after the break, no doubt, folks. Okay. So we're going to take a short break now. We're going to be back. We're going to be back at 8:05, I think. Just before you run off, just a reminder, our next talk is on the 9th of June. It is with the awesome Dr. Megan Crawford. How do I know she's awesome? Because she gave this talk for Glasgow Skeptics a few weeks back. It was top notch. It is called Failure and Redemption, How Science Saves Science. There was a question in Facebook earlier on about whether we do actual in-pub events now. Well, we specifically don't, but there's lots of other skeptic groups starting to wander out into the open air again, and for some bigger events coming up in the not too distant future, there's Skeptics on the Fringe up in Edinburgh in August. There's the European Skeptics Congress in Vienna in September, and towards the end of October we've of course got QED, so some exciting things up ahead of us. Now remember, folks, get your questions into Slido, and we'll tackle those after the break. Otherwise, charge your glasses, and we'll see you back in about 15 minutes' time.
See you soon.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you are suitably hydrated and drained of bladder. So we are back with Deborah Hyde. It is time for the Inquisition. Sorry, is that inappropriate? I did say I was going to try and offend you, Deborah. Step one there. Right?
You're going to have to do better than that.
We'll ramp it up as it goes on. Okay, so the first question we have is from the awesome Igor. Was the witch burning primarily an anti-woman affair? Was the amount of killed wizards and sorcerers even comparable?
Yeah, that was a subject which got a lot of interest as a result of second wave feminism in the 60s. And we've kind of, you know how ideas tend to go like this. They follow a sine wave, and you kind of go mad in one direction and mad in the other. And I think we've sort of regressed to the norm in our era a bit. Definitely, from all of the respectable work that's been done on it, it appears that far more women than men were executed during the Great Witch Hunts. And the witch hunts were during the 16th and 17th centuries. So the case that we looked at in 1441 earlier today really was at the beginning, way kind of before the great witch hunts that we would think of from Europe. but in general, it's thought it was about 25% men and about 75% women. So definitely they did get more women. That might have been partly incidental, as later on with the witch hunts, they tended to get poor people as well. So, you know, if you were a single woman, if you had been widowed or something like that, you were more likely to become poor without a main breadwinner in your house anymore. So it might have been sort of a corollary. We know how we can't put, as skeptics, you know, you've got to be careful the way that you arrange your causal links. But yes, I mean, witch hunters did seem to go more for women than they did for men, but it wasn't really exclusively like that. And there were some places, I think in Russia, for example, where they went far more for men than they did for women. So it's a very complicated picture. You can't really draw many sort of generalizations from it. And certainly the idea that we have that this was basically a way of getting at women was certainly taken up a lot in second wave feminism, and there was a lot of sort of rather dodgy theorizing done on that theory at the time. And also it was promoted by the witch cult hypothesis from the early 20th century, which was a very fine Egyptologist who should have stuck to Egyptology, was saying that basically that witchcraft was a self-conscious parallel religion in Europe at the time, and that it was a political attempt to try and stamp this out that had caused the witch hunts. And it's not at all taken seriously now, but it kind of was by the time that feminists were writing about this stuff in the 60s. So the truthful answer is it's a very complicated picture. Definitely more women were executed than men, but a lot of men were too. And you've got to look really at the nuances of both the era and the area to work out exactly why people were got at particular times in particular places.
And I mean, something I wrote down in my detailed notes was the phrase perverse incentive. I was going to use that as a search term later on tonight, right? But it seems like in those cases that sort of financial incentive to identify somebody would, I guess, by definition, would be more directed towards men who are more likely to be the holders of wealth. Is that not correct? So did that scale the number of men up even further than it might have done otherwise?
Well, this is the point about the Inquisition and about the era that we're dealing with, which is 15th century, a lot earlier than the great witch hunts, the 16th and 17th centuries, when you would get you get poorer people. And yes, but it is a perverse incentive to have an institution which is rewarded on results-based behaviour, because what do you do when you run out of results? It's also a very interesting question about what do you do with an institution when its raison d'etre evaporates, and you have to be able to either have an ongoing mission or you have to be able to declare yourself unemployable or unemployed. And not many people do that willingly. So it's kind of, this is why checks and balances are really good, because you need somebody to be able to turn around and say, you're talking bollocks or you're out of order. And in a situation where you have these rather institutionalized power setups, you might not get that, and you might get someone scrabbling around for the point of them. Fortunately, in the case of the Dominicans, they had that parallel mission, which was education. So they sort of turned into an educational group, and I'm sure there are some Dominicans who do a perfectly good job of teaching physics and mathematics these days. But as we saw, that came from not a great place, which was a desire to inculcate their students with, and to inculcate the world with their own authoritarian top-down idea of the way that things should work. Okay, thank you. On a lighter topic, always been asked, can we see your dog, do you know
please?
what I would like? But she isn't little, and if she doesn't want to do it, if she comes around here, I'll try and get her up to the camera. If she doesn't want to do it, I can't. She's
so yeah. I mean, there's been some excitement in the Twitch chat anytime there's been rustling happening down below, and I'm hoping that's a dog and not you, Deborah. So You could be generating a lot of static if that's the case otherwise. All right, so keep your fingers crossed, folks. Maybe we'll see the dog at some
you just
point.
have
But
to imagine Scooby-Doo with an even dafter look on its face, and you've kind of got it.
there you go. Skeptical dog. Brilliant. Okay, next question is from Nadia. Why is an old woman associated with badness and sin rather than life experience and wisdom? Has it always been this way? And if not, when did it change?
Yeah, that's interesting. And also sort of, fat, fertile women as well are. You get these sort of Venus type figures from the ancient Middle East, where they've got women with sort of very protuberant breasts and protuberant buttocks, and it seems like an awful lot of our standards of goodness, of virtue, of all these various things, they're selective over eras and over areas as well. It's part of the rather entrenched sexism of most cultures, I suppose, that perhaps if a man has power, then he'll be looking for what he wants in a woman, and that quite often isn't an attitude. So, I don't know when. I mean, on a peer-to-peer level, older women are respected. I think people look to older women in their families. But I know what you mean about art and institutionally, and it's a sort of sense of ugliness, isn't it? There's a great etching by oh God, I can't remember his name, and I know the artist so well, but it's kind of like this old grotesque woman on a broomstick, and it's meant to represent the grotesquerie of both the physicality of it as well, but also the corruption to her soul. So yes, we don't esteem age or wisdom as much as we should, and especially in our era as well. It's possibly worse than it ever was before, because of the TV shows or movies or whatever. It's been like it for decades. Is all of the protagonists are about 25, and people 55 do interesting things too.
It seems like a lot of the questions tonight might boil down to, it was a great excuse to slap down the women, right? And one thing that strikes me is, if, again, let's take older male, older female, right? Older male, wisdom, great. Older female, wisdom, sure, great. Is that threatening to people? Like that, there's an intelligent woman there with resources and knowledge. Does it somehow sort of emasculate people in power, and that just by pure definition, singles them out as a target?
Well, it took, yeah. I mean, there aren't. The way that feminism has come on, we have to appreciate, I think, that we live at a very, very unusual time, because I had a friend years ago. She was a lot older than I was. She's passed away now, but she was a highly skilled shorthand secretary. She could type when you needed to be. You couldn't just sort of go back on your computer. And she was in her 20s in the 1950s, and she had a job. She was living with her father, but she had somewhere to live. She had regular income, and she wanted to sign a hire purchase agreement so she could get a TV for her father. And she had to get her boyfriend to co-sign it. It wasn't even a man she was married to or lived with or anything like that. They just didn't want a woman. This was in like 1959 or 1960. We have to. Every so often, we just have to remember what feminism, especially second wave feminism, has done for women over the last few decades. Because until really recently, it was all like this. And generally, what you have is that you have, and also we're stratified by class as well. Not all men have the power. A lot of men have a really shitty time because they're at the bottom of the heap as well. So, but I mean, there is that assumption that the man should be in charge, and the woman gives him too much lip, and that's undesirable. And it's just a reminder of just how much our lives have changed over the last few decades. Very easy to forget.
Sure, particularly some of the depressing news stories of late. Okay. We're back with Igor again. Next question. Do you think modern affairs like the satanic panic or the Q craziness about pizza parlours are similar in nature to witch hunts, or is there something else going on?
Right. So, I think that there is a lot that's very similar in the underlying dynamic. I think the idea of witch hunts in general. You see, this is why I think that the subject that I'm interested in is useful instead of just titillating. It can be just titillating. You could sit and read horror stories all day, and it's fun, and why not? But I think that studying social dynamics is really, really useful, and also studying how funky people's beliefs can get before anybody says, you've got to stop that, that's too weird, is really interesting. It's relevant, and the way that witch hunts start, because obviously not all witch hunts involve witches. So it's about contagion of ideas. From an individual point of view, it's about how people end up constructing their worldviews and which people are more likely to believe in some things than other people. So I would argue that the reason that my whole subject is important rather than just frivolous is because there are lots of similarities in social dynamics and the individual psychology of the kind of things that you see hundreds of years ago and those kinds of things that you see now.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a weird mesh of sort of religion and politics at the moment now as well, though. Like, I mean, maybe it was always the case, but it seems like it's a really easy option to paint your political enemies as Satanists and baby eaters and such like. I mean, did that happen at a higher political level back in the 1600s as well, Deborah, or is this
Well, I think this is
phenomenon?
What we're seeing here with the case of Margery Jourdemayne. The idea that somebody would, I mean, the authorities in London and in England at the time were, they were fair. They knew that soothsayers and charmers and sort of low-level witches and all that kind of thing, cunning people, were operating, and they were kind of tolerated. I mean, they just did business, and so the fact that somebody was burnt alive publicly really was quite a thing. I mean, they didn't do this to lots of people, not at that stage. Even then, actually, later on in England, there weren't as many sort of witch killings as there were on the continent, and people were hanged, not burned. So the fact that so on one hand you had this whole category of people that were really kind of tolerated, but on the other hand she is just one example of several actually where magic and sorcery and heresy became a factor of political life. And it's quite clear as we went through, and you saw the family tree with Duke Humphrey and his siblings, that his two brothers died, and that his other brother, Henry V, had also died. So he was very close to power. And that's the whole thing about Margery Jourdemayne's fall, is unfortunately, if she had just been seeing anybody else in the city, even after the stiff warning that she had had 10 years prior, she probably would have been okay. She was caught up in political intrigue that was bigger than her, and that's what she fell foul of. So this was a not uncommon way of trying to politically get to people.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that stiff warning later on, but I don't want to jump questions. So let's go to Grimbeard next. How much would recanting actually helped? Was it just the difference between burned alive and burned to death, or could you get let off? It
depends where and when. So we know that, for example, if you'd been around the time of the Canon Episcopi, really what they just wanted to stop people doing this magic stuff, and they really wanted to stop giving credibility to it. They wanted to stop people believing in it. So you probably could have done a lot of penance and been let back into the community. We've seen with Margery Jourdemayne herself that in 1431 too, that she probably recanted, apologised, and gave a bond against her future good behaviour. So yeah, it really, so in many circumstances it would have worked. They would have just sort of dismissed you and said, you know, don't be so stupid in the future. But in this case, they couldn't do that because it was really high politics. I mean, this was hardcore politics. They couldn't just let it go. And it depends where and when you were. If you were in the middle of the Inquisition running through your town, and you were some, you know, isolated place in the French Alps, and, you know, and there was a Dominican coming along and was just tearing through the middle of the community, then he might have had an agenda on his mind, and you might not have had a chance. If you were in the middle of a city and you'd just been caught selling charms, you know, a few penances. So it really did depend on where and when you were. And it's worth remembering that Margery Jourdemayne herself did get off pretty much scot-free 10 years prior. It was only because she got involved with really big politics that she ended up being burnt on the second occasion.
Okay, yeah, and you know what, you've come back to it. So this is one of the things that was, you know, raising my eyebrows during the talk was, you know, let's assume that Brian didn't pay much attention in history class back at school. You know, there's just this general assumption that back then, like, anything you did was, you know, was going to end very badly for you if you ended up in, you know, on the hands of the authorities. You know, you fart in the wrong direction on a Wednesday, you get a poker up your arse, right? So it's really strange to me that you know, there's been an incident, she's got away with it, right, at great cost, and it doesn't appear to have, you know, pushed her career off in a more safe direction, right? I mean, was there no other options for her to try and, you know, keep
well, it was clearly worth a while, and clearly she felt that the risks were really low. So, and she was dealing with the kind of the highest woman in the land. So, you know, who wouldn't be a bit tempted? And the idea that you had that that justice was appalling and rough and deadly comes from a slightly later time in history. Things were far more laissez-faire in the late sort of medieval and late medieval era. What you have after the Reformation, kind of 16th, 17th centuries, is there's a few things. I suppose that the roughest time for justice maybe would have been kind of like the 18th century or so, something. That's when you're thinking about people being transported for stealing an apple, you know. And in those cases, they had a lot of social issues that they hadn't quite got to grips with how to deal with them. So there had been an awful lot of people moving towards cities. So there was a sort of itinerant population, not necessarily any kind of employment for them yet. In the medieval times, you get a sense that the authorities tried to create stasis. I mean, it's a waste of time, right? Because you've got climate and wars and God knows what. You can't create stasis. But there was an attempt at creating these certain social relationships in order that you could create a certain world for everybody. And under those circumstances, if no random factors come in, you can be reasonably okay to people. But, you know, in the 1700s, the people crowding into cities, not enough employment for them. There was no social security. The church had provided whatever social security was available 300 years earlier. So it wasn't there. You stole or you starved. Plus which it was a colonial era for the Western countries, and they needed to send warm bodies over to other places to colonize them. So that was a great solution. You know, somebody stole something, you'd send them off to a colony as forced labor to go and work in, you know, the southern United States or something. So it was a combination of all sorts of factors that brought together a far fiercer environment than had prevailed in England in the 15th century. The other thing about when Margery Jourdemayne lived was that it wasn't a bad time for the working classes. The Black Death had come along in 1350 or 1348 to 50, you know, depending on where in Europe you were. And at that point, really, as much land as could be occupied and reasonably farmed was in Europe. So if you wanted to make any money, if you wanted to do anything, especially if you were from sort of the upper classes, you were scrabbling around for fewer resources. You know, everything had been accounted for. After the great dieback of the Black Death, that actually helped working class people because, first of all, the land that was left to farm was supporting far fewer people, so you could go back to the prime land. You didn't have to start sort of farming anything marginal. And second of all, labour was really short. So Labour was, for a change, in charge. They could ask for more money. They could ask for money rather than payment in kind. People weren't supposed to leave their manors, but they did. So you had a movable workforce, kind of the beginning of the middle classes. So apart from the hideous death element to it, the decades after the Black Death allowed for a certain kind of social mobility and a certain sort of change. If you'd asked me, would I want to go back and be a peasant in 1430 or 1730, I would choose 1430 in a moment.
Excellent. Great endorsement there. Okay. So, Margery, you little scamp, off you go. Don't do it again. So when she got, or, when she's caught 10 years later, was there perhaps a presumption of being safe because she was giving advice to someone in a position of power?
I think she probably felt that way. I think she probably didn't understand the political dangers around her. So, I mean, she must have felt that way, but of course she ended up being uniquely vulnerable because of it. And also, we know the people that she was got with, and we know that they knew her, and they were also accusing each other. So, but we still don't know exactly what she did. Was she helping with necromancy with, Thomas Southwell? She probably wasn't. No. She probably was a tradesman of a different strand. She was probably doing love and fertility magic with Eleanor, and she just knew the other people. But nonetheless, the thing that I find fascinating about her is that she had credibility amongst the most educated people that you could find. Duke Humphrey himself was very interested in the new learning that was coming through, the translations of the old Greek and Roman texts that I said, as I said, had been saved in the Islamic world. And they were coming through from lots of places, through Spain and that kind of thing. And so he was interested in these astrological texts and these allegedly magical texts. So she was mixing with these really sort of high social status, but also educated people too. And she passed. She was clean enough. She was clever enough. She was socially adept enough, So she, that's why I think she's a really fascinating character.
For sure. All right. Before we move on to the next one, 20 quid back in the day. How much does that compare to now?
I haven't done the translation, but it was a lot. Yeah, it was a lot.
All right. Smart arses, get into Twitch chat, please. I want to know, what 20 quid back then, what could I buy with that equivalent now, please? And while we're waiting for that to come in, let's go to the next question from As an Android. Question is, how did fire come to be established as the means of execution for heresy? And why was fire not the means of execution for divination, necromancy, charms,
right? Yes, I think the reason that fire was, I suppose, there's the symbolisation of cleansing, of cleaning something, but it was because they were sadists. I mean, the people who did this wanted to make a public statement. Certainly, with the case of Joan of Arc, they wanted to make a public statement that she wasn't credible, the king she had crowned wasn't credible, and the god she claimed to represent wasn't credible. They were credible instead. And I think it was a disincentive. Bear in mind, it was only used for really, really sort of big charges, for high political charges. Later on, when people were hanged under other witchcraft statutes, by then it had degenerated into witchcraft, not heresy. So heresy was an offence against the established powers, the established powers of the church. And this was somebody, this was for people who are prepared to be sadistic about enforcing their own status and power on a situation. Then it's it works, doesn't it? It's extraordinarily painful. And anybody who would watch it would think, well, I'm not going to do that then.
Mm-hmm. How does it compare to hung, drawn and quartered? If you had to choose one, which would you go for?
Running in the other direction in both cases. Although if you were going to be hanged, drawn and quartered, you might be able to tip the executioner to kind of overhang you a bit before you got drawn and quartered. Mind you, I guess you could tip the executioner to strangle you a bit before you were burnt. Don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Always benefits to be well hung. Okay.
No, you aren't.
Moving on. Next question from Garnet. How rife were the accusations of witchcraft and their persecutions? Was it a rare event, or do we have a sensationalized, warped view of it being commonplace? Maybe that's the kind of, it depends where you were and when it was, right?
Well, because we think of,
for us?
What are called the Great Witch Hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries. Even then, they weren't massively common. It depends where you were. You might have a very, very enthusiastic inquisitor where you were, and you might just feel like the sky was falling in, and sort of families were obliterated and things like that. But there were other places as well where the secular authorities and also the church authorities just weren't into this stuff. I mean, one of the things I wonder about with Ad Extirpanda, with the papal bull, and with the Dominicans being subject only to the Pope, to me that suggests that the Pope was wrestling a little, perhaps, with local priests as well, because in the Holy Roman Empire, the local priests weren't just the vicars or administering to spiritual powers. Sometimes you would have a whole area. The Holy Roman Empire is kind of like a stripe down the middle of Europe, and a lot of what is now Germany was part of it, and it was lots of little areas. It was kind of like boroughs, and some of them were ruled by bishop princes who embodied the power of both the church and the secular state in the one person. And the fact that the Pope felt the need to have a whole group of brothers who followed only his orders makes me wonder sometimes if there was tension, because sometimes the person who's at the top of the tree doesn't always call the shots. You've got, sometimes the king really manages to make all of the earls underneath him do everything. Sometimes the earls have actually sort of got the king because they're more powerful. So you wonder how the power is distributed when somebody needs somebody of their own like that. Yeah, so what the original question was about, which time and place, wasn't it?
Yeah, how common was it in general?
If you went to, there are various places in the centre of Europe post-Reformation which were hideous. There's if you ever watch one of my werewolf talks, I do a talk about people accused of werewolfism. There's one case of a guy called Peter Stubb, who I wonder if it was a political execution, because you had Catholic forces pushing in one way, and then you had the Protestant forces pushing the other way, and then the Catholic forces coming back. So you had what was both a religious but also a secular war. And he was executed in the most appalling way. He was broken on a big wheel, and it was. And he was. You've got to wonder whether or not they were making an example of a local person who had a certain amount of power at a certain time. So under those circumstances, you would look at that and you would just see anarchy. You would see witchcraft everywhere. You would see people accusing people of being witches everywhere, and you would just think this is awful. But in sort of half of England at the time, nothing would have happened. So it really did. I mean, in England in general, there weren't that many witch trials. There were in Scotland, a bit more. And in England, they tended to be they tended to be little rashes of them. So it really does depend where and when and the prevailing circumstances.
Okay. Anonymous question now. Is it a coincidence that the site of her house is now Buckingham Palace? It reads like a plot point from a children's fantasy book. I was going to go more Dan Brown, but fair
Dan
enough,
Brown,
Anonymous.
that would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah. I don't know about you, but I love walking through places that not that I can walk through Buckingham Palace, but I like sort of walking down streets and knowing that people have been walking down them for hundreds, possibly even thousands of years. And it's kind of it's interesting to look at a map of old Westminster and see that it was, you know, it was this sort of marshy little island, and they built the abbey on a relatively firm bit, but the rest of it had to be filled in as time went on. And yeah, they did. They drained the swamp. And of course, these little rivulets still run under there. There are still rivers running through London. I know about the ones in London. I don't know about the ones in other cities, but they'll be in other cities too. So yeah, and then Buckingham Palace was, they didn't actually have to make anyone homeless to do that. Buckingham Palace was built on Buckingham House, and then that was built on something prior to that. So it had been vacated as a ford over this little tributary for many years by the time somebody came along and stuck their big fat house on it.
Yeah, they didn't have to make anybody homeless. They went and kicked a few poor people probably just for good measure though, right? Okay. Igor, again, how much of this OG satanic panic was motivated by believing in foul wizardry, and how much of it was the desire to burn the neighbour and take his stuff?
Yeah, later on, the 16th and 17th centuries ones, what you get is a lot of, it's not entirely, but you quite often get a pattern where the person who was the witch was the poorest person in the village. And you're thinking, well, hold on a second, if they're a witch, aren't they supposed to be powerful? But in fact, the dynamic that you quite often get is that the person had asked for charity and they had been rebuffed. And the person who rebuffed them then accused them of witchcraft. So you have a situation where people are kind of, all of them living on the breadline. And some people are slightly more on the breadline than others. As I said earlier, if your husband died, you know, you might have skills, you might be able to do things, but if you couldn't charge as much for them as man could, and you might have dependents. So somebody who was going around asking for charity was a pain in the neck because you felt your Christian duty to give them something. On the other hand, they were depleting your already meagre stores. And we see this, the same dynamic is obvious. I don't know if anybody in this group follows the Nigerian witchcraft accusations. There's a guy called Leo Igwe over there.
Leo Igwe, yeah. We had him in Glasgow a few years back.
Sort of like trying to skepticize belief in witchcraft, for example. But the dynamics are exactly the same as they were in an English village, 400 years ago, where basically somebody who needs the support of the group, but the group is already kind of, on their hands and knees poor, and the person doesn't have a defender. And this is why the people who are accused of witchcraft are quite often children, is because it's basically a decent way of getting rid of somebody who is depleting the group without leaving you with a guilty conscience.
So what you're saying is that Christians found a way of demonizing poor people despite what it says in their book. And they've even found some stuff in their book to help them do it. I can't imagine that happening now.
It would never happen today.
Never happen today.
But back in those days, yeah. This seems to have been, there's quite often the dynamic. And again, we're talking about post-Reformation, when we didn't yet have a welfare state where the government was supposed to help people, or the church was supposed to help people. The church wasn't that kind of institution anymore. So there was, we're going through a dip where there isn't the same kind of safety net, and where people would accuse other people as a way of not having to share. while still keeping their consciences clear. A great generalisation. Obviously, there were all kinds of other witch trials too, but that tends to be more of a pattern. Whereas in the early time, the time we've been talking about today, in 1441, with that you've got, you know, the kind of post-Carcassonne Albigensian heresy type stuff. That's sort of far more trying to root out heresy and, you know, high politics, that kind of stuff. So it does change in nature. I mean, this is the thing where you can't talk about, you know, the witch hunts or a witch, is because the very definition of the terms changes so much over the centuries, over the times that we're talking about.
Sure. I must admit, when, you know, in the early part of your talk, when you were talking about the rich people being targeted, you know, my sympathy levels were just a little bit lower at that point, but I get it. Okay. Question from Nadia. Was it feasible to persecute or execute mothers and grandmothers, or were childless women targeted mostly?
No. Family women were targeted too. In the era we're talking about, yeah, I mean, there's no particular sign of people being let off because they were mothers or grandmothers. Yeah, no, I'm trying to think of a few cases. There was no, I don't think there was any sense that somebody was sort of a bit, you know, somebody needed to remain with their family because they had dependents.
So there you go, Nadia. They were equal opportunity women haters back then. Isn't that nice? Okay, anonymous question. Who would be the modern equivalent of Jourdemayne? Something like a high-profile health influencer dating a minor royal? Something like that?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point, actually. I hadn't thought about that. My tag on Twitter is @Jourdemayne. And when I first started blogging, because I blogged about so many weird things, that's why I came up with the alter ego. Because I didn't know how many peculiar people I would attract. And turns out the answer is lots of them. And then I came out as me later. And the reason that I chose Jourdemayne as an alter ego was because I'm not an academic, but I feel, perhaps I have a lot of hubris, that I have something to contribute to the whole debate. And the point about Margery Jourdemayne was that she wasn't the highest in the land, but she certainly felt like she had something to contribute too. So, yeah, I mean, she's somebody without the official credentials, but somebody who certainly had influence. I would say that she probably had some real knowledge. I don't know how much a homeopathic influence has in terms of real knowledge, but yeah, it would have to be, wouldn't it? It would have to be you know, some kind of alt med influencer, or perhaps sort of with a website like Gwyneth Paltrow's. Yeah,
possibly. Yeah, it's adorable that you were pleasantly surprised by how many weird people you found on the internet.
Well, I know they're out there. I just wondered if many of them would chase me or write to me. So.
Okay. Hey, well, and you got your Twitter handle out there, so make sure you follow, please, folks. Okay. Time's getting the better of us. We're going to go for the last question now, Deborah. Can you tell us, please, what's the face on your bookcase? And by the way, dear viewers, the fact like that during the break we had to specify which face on Deborah's bookcase we were talking about tells you everything you need to know about Deborah. So that one up there, what's going on up there, please?
You're not interested in the wolf skull or the gorilla skull, it's the face. Yeah, that is the face of, it's on a skull. This was many years ago, this was a background mask of a zombie I played in a film. And what we did was, in order, playing the zombie was the smallest part of the role for that film. I was actually the makeup effects production manager. And what the designer did was designed these masks so that if anybody was sort of 10 feet or further away from the camera, it's a lot easier to put on than a prosthetic makeup. So this was a prosthetic makeup as well. The same pieces could be stuck on, and you could move your face through them and all this kind of thing. But this was actually the background mask for when I was just a background player, and I played Stella the barmaid, and I was a violent man-eating zombie.
Awesome. What was the name of the movie, please?
Doghouse.
Doghouse. Okay, folks, get that YouTubed. Okay, so Deborah, thank you so much. Please, folks, in the Twitch chat, go wild for Deborah Hyde. No doubts we'll have you back at some point in the future, Deborah. Audience members, thank you for joining us. I just want to remind you again, our next talk is on the 9th of June. It's called Failure and Redemption, How Science Saves Science, with Dr. Megan Crawford. You can also support us in all the other ways. Follow us on the socials as well. And remember, very shortly, we're going to be spinning up our Zoom pub, the Lock-In's Razor. I'm going to be in there tonight. My wife finished her cancer treatment today, so I'm going to be getting drunk and probably ugly crying. I'll go to a breakout room when I'm going to ugly cry, though, so I don't disturb the chit-chat. So come join us in there. Otherwise, thank you for attending, everybody. See you next time. Eggman out.